property taxes in the state may be on the rise. We have the Senate Chair of the Taxes Committee, Julianne Ortman, here to discuss the House research study that was recently released. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Senator, I want to begin with that House nonpartisan office research, and it stated that essentially local property taxes are projected to rise statewide by $376 million in 2012, which is about 4.6%. Do you challenge this conclusion?
Oh, I would for sure, because there are assumptions built into this nonpartisan working group that they make assumptions in order to come up with their conclusions. And we found that the assumptions that they base their study on just are not factual. In particular, they also projected a huge increase in 2010 after the unallotments, and it just never materialized. It turned into what was a 1.9% increase in property taxes across the state because the assumptions were faulty. Local government elected officials also are very concerned about the economy right now, and they're concerned about the burdens being paid by our taxpayers. So they were fiscally responsible in 2010. We have every reason to believe that they're going to be again. So I think you have to look very closely at the assumptions that they're making when they make these projections.
Let's talk a little bit more about local governments. Do you think that they are doing the hard work to try to find savings and not pass along perhaps LGA cuts or other cuts that they may have experienced?
Well, let me go back. There were no LGA cuts. In fact, the LGA is maintained at previous levels going forward, and I think Minnesotans wanted to see that. They want to make sure that their cities have enough funds for essential services. What we did do is we did change the market value homestead credit, and we turned it into an exclusion of value. A little bit of a change, but it was recommended to us by the advocates for the cities and the counties across the state. So the League of Minnesota Cities, the Association of Minnesota Counties, and their counterparts throughout the state asked us to make that change. If we were going to make any reductions, they asked us to make it that one. And the reason was that we had only funded the program fully 9 times out of the 10 years it's been in existence. So they asked us to come back and say, wait a minute, if you're not going to fund this program, which is just another empty promise on the part of the state, please eliminate it. And so for us, it was about eliminating these empty promises and coming clean with our city partners, because what was happening was this market value credit was required by law to go on to the property owner's property tax statement, but we were not providing the funding for the credit to the cities and the counties. So again, we were leaving them holding the bag. So for me, this was about coming clean. I think most of my colleagues agree that it was time to eliminate a program that was completely broken.
Okay, and you did clarify the LGA concerns. Some local governments, though, do contend that because it was held harmless, there wasn't an increase, that essential services are still at risk. Do you buy into that argument at all?
I think the cities are in the same position the state is in and the federal government is in. Our revenues are not keeping up with the pace of our spending. That's just the physical reality of it. And so then we all have to make reductions because there's just less revenue. And the taxpayers really can't be asked to pay more. They're being asked to fund more government than they can afford. So it's incumbent upon all of us elected officials in all of our roles to go back and assess what our true needs and what our wants and bring our budgets back in line with what taxpayers can afford.
Now I want to get back to the homestead credit that you had just referenced a bit earlier. And House DFL tax leaders last month said that they plan to introduce legislation to try to reinstate the credit. Do you think the Senate GOP would consider this provision, this legislation?
No, and truly, I respect both of those members of the House, but it's intellectually dishonest to come back next year and say that they want to reinstate this program if they don't have the funding to pay for it, and they have not really offered up any source of funds to pay for it. And I think what most Minnesotans are missing is the fact that in order to provide these types of tax aids and credits to certain communities, we have to raise income and sales taxes in order to pay for them. And so I think when they understand that, they'll understand why we chose not to raise income and sales taxes and eliminate this program. And so I wish that they would offer up how they're going to pay for it. And I would also say that those same members have voted to eliminate the market value credit in the past. So we should look at their voting record on that as well.
Senator, I want to look ahead now to next session. It's not a budget year, but it is a policy year. What are some of the things that you're going to propose?
Well, if I can just add a little bit to what you said, I think that it will be a budget year next year, because the projected revenues that we based our budget on last year have not actually come true. So we assumed, based on Dr. Stinson's economic forecast, that we would have a 3% growth in GDP over the next few years. The fact is that the GDP is not growing that fast. So it looks like we may actually have a budget. And I would take you back to the property taxes. The Senate GOP job number one for last year, to help create jobs and also to eliminate some of the tax burden for our businesses, was to eliminate the statewide business property tax. And that will be goal number one for me in the Senate Tax Committee next year, is to find a way to eliminate that statewide business property tax. It kind of relates back to the market value credit and the LGA that we're talking about. There may be some shifting with the elimination of the market value credit, and it may end up shifting to some of the business properties in communities. But we've always said that we need to eliminate that statewide business property tax. The state should not be taxing properties. That should be for local governments. And if we can accomplish that, then I think that's a very key second piece of eliminating that market value credit. So that's why it will be a very important priority for us in the Tax Committee next year.
And as you brought up, the budget forecast could be less than what's been projected thus far. So in your opinion, is there room right now for more spending reductions if necessary?
I think there have to be spending reductions, and as I said, we all have to do our part here to downsize government spending, because the taxpayers are at risk here, and we need to make sure that families and businesses in Minnesota can succeed, because when they thrive, really the entire state does.
Okay, Senator, my last question for you. Would you agree with this statement? The state budget deficit has not been solved, but only pushed down the road through accounting gimmicks.
I wouldn't agree with the statement. I would say we haven't resolved as much of the structural deficit as I would like. And had we adopted the $34 billion budget that the legislature was comfortable with, we would have eliminated a whole bunch more of that structural deficit. I think that was really a result of what happened with the government shutdown and Governor Dayton's unwillingness to see things from our point of view. It left us with spending that nobody really wanted to engage in except the governor. And so with that extra spending, I think we lost a lot of the real reform and the elimination of the structural deficit that we all had as a high priority. So we'll come back next year and hope to do even more to eliminate the structural deficit.
Do you anticipate hearing in your committee proposals like expanding sales tax or income tax increases as well? Do you anticipate any of this?
Well, I think people are looking at those proposals right now. I think major reforms this year will be very hard to undertake, given the fact that I think we are going to see another budget. We've also got some constitutional amendments related to budget. We've got one in the Senate that talks about restricting spending to 98% of projected revenues. I hope to hear that in the Tax Committee this year, and lots of reform ideas as well.
Okay, on that note, Senator Julianne Ortman, thanks so much for your time. We always appreciate it.
So good to be here. Thanks for having me.